This is going to be Comics vs. Show for The Walking Dead, Season 5, Episode 14, Spend. This is just a fun look at some of the differences between the show and the comics, and obviously I can't list them all, but these are the major ones that stood out for me. These won't be any spoilers for the show, but they will be spoilers for the comics. So just like in the show, in the comics, Gabriel does end up coming to the leader of Alexandria, even though it's Douglas, not Deanna, and says, "These people are terrible, you need to get them out of here, they've done terrible things." But unlike the show, in the comics, the leader of Alexandria is more like, you know, we've all done terrible things, I've murdered people, you need to, like, GTFO out of here because I don't care what you have to say about them, they are staying. You can be the one to go. But in the show, we see Deanna being like, oh, this is very interesting, thank you for telling me, I'll think more on of it. So kind of a different reaction, even though in the comics and the show, Gabriel does come to the leader of Alexandria saying, you need to kick these people out. And obviously in the comics, Maggie doesn't hear this whole exchange happen. Abraham does have a freak out in the comics, just like in the show, about going out beyond the wall to do construction. In the comics, we see him sitting on the bed sweating as Rosetta sleeps, and him kind of being like, hey, get it together. In the show, we see him in front of the mirror splashing water on his face, and then we also see him outside in the construction area kind of freaking out a little bit. So the freak out happens both in the comics and the shows. Also with Francine, in the comics her name's Holly, but in the show her name's Francine. She does start to get it being attacked by walkers, and then Tobin is like, oh, nope, we need to get in formation. It's too late for her, you know, but we can keep ourselves alive. And Abraham's like, screw that. In both the show and the comics, it actually does go and rescue Francine/Holly and get her out of there. And in the end, Holly/Francine does hit Tobin, but in the comics she hits him between the legs and he ends up vomiting. In the show, she just decks him across the face. Speaking of the construction thing, Tobin does later go to the leader of Alexandria and say, hey, I'm giving Abraham the power because this, and he deserves it, and whatnot. And the leader of Alexandria is a little bit in the comics like, hey, we're giving these people power, you know, you need to lead them, you need to not step down. And Tobin's like, no, he deserves it. And then Abraham does end up taking control of the construction and all that. However, in the show, we see Tobin go, and then Deanna's there, her husband's there, and Maggie's there, and they all have the conversation together. So it's just a little bit different how the conversation goes. Instead of just being with the leader of Alexandria like in the comics, in the show it's more of a group of people talking about it, but the same conclusion is reached in the comics like the show. They decide that Abraham should take that responsibility. The abusive subplot does happen in the comics, just like it's happening in the show right now. Obviously, Carol doesn't come forward with this to Rick in the show. Rick notices the boy with the black eye and then talks to Michonne about it. Michonne's like, hey, this is, you know, kind of your job, you need to go do it. And so he talks to Jesse and realizes that Pete is abusive, and then he ends up taking care of it. And then so that's just a little different than in the show, where Carol's the one that figures it out and goes to Rick and is like, we need to take care of this. And obviously this is not how we see the leader of Alexandria's child die in the comics. In the comics he dies a little bit differently, which I'm not going to spoil just in case they do that storyline with the second child she supposedly has in the show. But in the comics she only has one child, and he doesn't die how he died in the show. In the show she actually has two boys, so the second boy may die how we see in the comics, we don't know yet, and I don't want to spoil that death for you. So those were the biggest differences and similarities that I saw in this episode. Not a ton this time, but still fun to look at. If you have your own differences and similarities that you found, you can list them below. Otherwise, make sure you like and subscribe.